This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very delighted to have been invited to chair Gail's. We like the fact that we both got the name Gail, but Gail's paper today. Gail is Professor of Sociology at Plymouth and has a big body of work covering many areas of what I think of as sort of social policy, welfare, health, education. To me, is all kind of social policy type issues, but also methodology. She's produced some really insightful work on methodological approaches. And what I particularly like in Gail's work is that she absolutely refuses the idea that reflexivity somehow compromises the political project or the project of rigour in our research. For what I love is that she insists on saying, actually, they're inseparable. So that's fantastic, and thank you for those contributions, because they've helped me enormously, I have to say. Gail's going to speak for about 50 minutes on to be or not to be a mother, thinking about mothers and others through literature and social science. And then we will have an opportunity to take some questions and discussion. We're a bit late. I'm going to give Gail the full, on the end. Give Gail the full 50 minutes. I'll give you a shout at 10 minutes to go, and we can open from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gail. Thanks very much. And thank you very much to Victoria and Jill for inviting me to what I'm sure everybody will agree with me has been a wonderful conference, really, really interesting methodological insights. So I'm really grateful for this space to be able to basically focus on my journey through what I usually term non-/motherhood, both academically and personally. And I think there's quite a lot of links with lots of the papers that I've heard so far. And I really can't do justice to all of those, so I'm not going to, but I hope that quite a few of you will see connections with some of the things that you've been saying too. My life hasn't turned out the way I thought it would that afternoon at school in 1975, when, having failed my maths O-level, I was told by the visiting careers advisor, well, that's university out for you then. At the time, I didn't mind, as all I wanted to do was to work with children in preparation for the ones I fully expected to later mother. I left school and I trained as a nursery nurse, and I worked for 10 years before returning to higher education in 1987. During this time, I also attempted for several years to get pregnant. I managed it once, but I miscarried at 16 weeks, and to my knowledge, I've not been pregnant again. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some of my research and writing experiences with specific reference to reproductive and non/parental identities and sociological, feminist, autobiographical practices and creative processes and approaches, because as Gail says, I think these things are intimately connected, and I can't really talk about what I do without talking about how I do it. So inevitably I'm going to talk about my own experience personally as well as academically as well. So just to give you an idea of the kind of work I do in this area. So as I say, I generally call it reproductive and non-parental identities, though most of my work is in the area of motherhood, non-motherhood. But I have done some work on fathers and non-fathers, which is why I include the parental here. So they're not linear in terms of the times that I've done them, but essentially I've done a series of projects looking at pregnancy, loss, miscarriage, termination, some of which I'm currently undertaking at the moment. My PhD was on infertility and involuntary childlessness. You'll notice throughout the presentation there are various words that I put in single quotation marks, essentially to highlight the problems of definition, that the words aren't that simple really. I then undertook a series of projects. I was at Coventry University for 11 years. I undertook a series of projects looking at teenage pregnancy and young parenthood, which included a reference to young men's experience. The young father there is in single quotation marks, because very often teenage girls have relationships with men that are much, much older, so they're not always necessarily young. And I'm currently working on a series of projects looking at long-term conditions in pregnancy, including women with pre-existing diabetes who are pregnant, and women who have polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, who are told often that they can't get pregnant, but interestingly we're finding a lot of them do, and then the pregnancy is quite unexpected, and then that brings new and different problems. And I've also done some writing around voluntary childlessness and social parenthood, so quite a lot of work in this kind of area really. As Gail said, alongside this I've always really been fascinated by methodology and epistemology, so I'm really interested in the relationship between what we do and what we get, and I really think that we have to talk about our process if our product is to be anything meaningful. I've also done work on working and learning higher education, a little bit on crime and the sociology of travel, but that's another story and isn't really relevant for today. So sticking with the methodological for a minute then, I agree with many feminists and other writers in this area that all research and writing is an autobiographical practice that we engage in as insider and outsider, and that we move in and out of these identities as insider and outsider, and that research and writing is an intellectual activity that involves us in the consideration of power, emotion and politics. So following on from C. Wright Mills, I really do believe that we're not outside of society, we're part of it, and therefore any work that we do has to recognise the significance of our context, our place within the context. So sociology, specifically feminist and autobiographical approaches and writings, have provided me with the opportunity to critically engage with issues that are central to my own life and to the lives of others that I share a personal and professional experience with. I think this is both a privilege and a responsibility that I take seriously, and something that I continue to defend as vital to the sociological project. My academic work has, quite rightly, been subject to debate and criticism by others. But I would argue sometimes unjustly so when I have engaged with the autobiographical. Work which draws on and celebrates the experiential can and has been described as unacademic and as sensational journalism. And whilst I have received lots of support for my work in this area, it has also on different occasions been described as, and I quote, sickly self-indulgent and gross self-advertisement and self-dramatised rubbish. It hasn't stopped me though, I have to say. I've been lucky that my career has taken place at a time where there has been a space for what Liz Stanley calls the autobiographical eye, and I've received enough support and encouragement not to be put off by the critique. I also believe that what I do is thoroughly sociological and thoroughly academic, both substantively, methodologically and epistemologically. As I said, for many years I've been interested in the relationship between the research process and the research project, between the knowing and doing relationship, and I've argued for a position that I call theorised subjectivity, which requires the constant critical interrogation of our personhood. So rather than going into a research relationship saying, I'm attempting to be objective and this is how I get there, we go into a research relationship saying, this is my subjective position, and if I can theorise on that and the significance of my personhood to the work that I'm doing, then I get closer to something that we might call objective. For my PhD, as I said, I took a study on issues of identity with reference to infertility and involuntary childlessness. This was prompted, as you might have already guessed, by my own miscarriage. I did an undergraduate project on miscarriage, so I actually started my work in this area as an undergraduate, and on my own experience of infertility. You know, at that time, the time that I started the research, you know, I fit the medical definition of infertile. And so right from the beginning then, my research had an autobiographical element. And as I said, I was really interested to explore this, not just because I felt it was a misunderstood and misrepresented area, but that it was quite clear that other people felt this too. Like many of the issues we've been talking about at this conference, infertility and involuntary childlessness, which of course are not necessarily the same thing. You can be infertile and yet be mothering children, even your own biological children, because we know that quite a lot of infertility treatment doesn't cure infertility, it just kind of bypasses the problem. But of course you could also be mothering or fathering in a social relationship with a child. So they are distinct and different, but they're clumped together a lot of the time and affected and determined by dominant external discourses, by loud voices really, externally, medical, political, media, lay. And what I was able to find in my research was I was able to offer kind of a lay challenge, a lay discourse challenge to these external voices. And probably the most predominant stereotype around this experience is that of the desperate childless woman. So any program that you've ever seen with an infertility expert, and usually it's the male infertility experts we see when we watch programs, are standing in front of lots of pictures which they actually talk about as my babies, you know, the babies that they've kind of helped to produce. And, you know, they're seen as miracle workers in the way that they've helped the desperate to have the babies that they wanted. Now, the time I started my research, there was quite a lot of feminist writing around new reproductive technologies at the time, some of which we heard about yesterday. And feminists were arguing that what we needed to do was to separate women from this discourse of desperation, and you know, that it wasn't about desperation. And what I found in my research is that I wanted to kind of subtly change that argument, really. So whereas I agreed that it isn't, we cannot classify women in this situation as inevitably desperate all of the time, and that becomes their master status, their stigmatized identity. But I did argue that they were women, and I interviewed a small number of men, but mostly women who felt desperate about this part of their experience at some time in their life, not necessarily all of their life, though sometimes it lasted for a long time. So it was people and women with feelings of desperation rather than desperate people. But there was also an agency in there too, in that a lot of the people who spoke to me said that they worked with the stereotype and they worked with this identity of desperation. So women talked to me about going to their doctor and crying even though they didn't want to cry, because they know they'd get their test results back quicker. So, you know, they worked with the stereotype and made it work for them. And then what was very interesting was that yesterday, Victoria very kindly talked about my meanings of miscarriage work. And this was relevant to this project too, in that the meanings were different for different people. So, for example, I talked to one woman who had experienced primary and secondary infertility, had found it difficult to get pregnant twice, and it had taken her a very long time, but she'd also experienced cancer twice. And she talked about her infertility being the most important thing that had ever happened to her, the most serious and significant thing that had ever happened to her. I talked to another woman who had also experienced primary and secondary infertility, and had eventually had 2 sons, and then following this a couple of years later had split up with her partner, and talked to me how that her relationship breakdown was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. So, you know, we need to think about individuals within this kind of like broad contextualised experience, as it were. So what I was attempting to do was to give a more holistic explanation of infertility and involuntary childlessness, to talk about ambivalence, for example, in relation to this experience. Up until the time I was doing my research, I was very influenced by feminist work which allowed for the space for ambivalence for mothers, but there was very little work that allowed for the space for ambivalence for those who weren't mothers. So, if you decide not to have a child, as far as the world is concerned, then, if you change your mind later on, then it's kind of tough, really. You need to stick by your decisions. Alternatively, if you can't have a child and you want one, if you show any kind of ambivalence on that track, then you're seen as not deserving of the treatment that you might or might not be entitled to. So I was really keen to look at the issue of ambivalence in the lives of the childless as well as in the lives of women who had children. So I'll just talk about one more issue in relation to this at the moment. I was also very keen to challenge the idea that there was a resolution at the end of this experience. So I was distressed by the books that I read where there was always a last chapter which was about either coming to terms with your childlessness or getting the baby that you wanted at the end of it. And certainly what I found on my research is that it's constant adaptation. So feelings can come and go. So people might re-feel issues again when their friends begin to become grandparents, etc., etc. And different things in your life will affect the way in which you feel about the situation. Okay. When I moved to Coventry, I replied to a call for research from a local PCT to do a small amount of work, small project looking at housing needs for young mothers. And this led to a whole plethora of work that is still going on, really, although I'm less involved with it now. My colleagues of Coventry are still carrying on. But I was involved in 8 or 9 projects, all qualitative projects, but essentially looking at the experience of over 250 young women who had decided to become parents, had decided to keep their babies. So it was around the support agenda, support side of the teenage pregnancy strategy in the UK at that time. And what was really interesting was that equally this experience is, as I'm sure you're aware, was affected by external dominant authoritative discourses, again medical, political and media, that these young women couldn't possibly make good mothers because they were too young and too ill prepared, and likely they came from the wrong side of the tracks, etc., etc. And there are a whole series of stereotypes around this experience, that young women are much more likely to engage in risky behaviour, not least from the fact that they got pregnant, and risky behaviour while they're pregnant, and to put their children at risk, to be calculating in that the only reason they got pregnant was to get a house. We've all heard that one, whereas we know that most young women have no idea at all of what they're entitled to after their baby is born, that they're going to be alone, they're bound to be a single parent, and that their lives will be completely out of control. And from all of the research that we've done, I can offer a real kind of challenge to this, in that young mothers are like any other type of mothers, really. There are different sorts, and they have different problems and different issues. Just to comment on the risky and at risk issue, we were actually asked to, because the one project led to several others, as I've said, we were actually asked to undertake a study in 2 areas of the West Midlands, whereas one of our funders was really concerned about the risky behaviour that young women were likely to engage in while they were pregnant. And what we found was that the thing that they were most at risk for was not accessing the services they were entitled to, and they often didn't access the service they were entitled to because of the prejudice that they were experiencing when they accessed those services that assumed that they were risky, So interesting, So breaking down the stereotypes is obviously really important to, again, provide us with a holistic idea of what's going on in the lives of mothers. So all of this work, there's just kind of two examples, have led me to think about several things in relation to motherhood and non-motherhood, and I've listed some of them here. You know, motherhood is lauded as inevitable and desirable for all of us, but if not achieved in the so-called right at the so-called right time and the so-called right social circumstances, it's frowned upon as a life choice. So when I give a lecture on this to my students, I sometimes say there's probably a week when you're 25 and a bit and you're nicely settled and you've got some money in the bank and you've got a nice partner, etc., when it's right to be a mother, and all of the times is just kind of inappropriate, really. As we know, the experience of mothering is usually much more complicated than the promise. So there's a really interesting book, if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend you to look at it, by a woman called Jane Mills, called Woman Words, where she actually looks at the words that have been used to describe women over the ages, and there are some really interesting ones about mother and mothering in relation to there. And you know, we know that for every time that mothering is kind of lauded, it's criticised. So again, we can't do right for doing wrong, as it were. Mothers are also bombarded by expert views and cautions, even though at the same time mothering is supposed to be instinctual for all of us. We have to take advice on how to do it. In my nursery nursing, when I was doing my nursery nursing course, I was taught by a woman who was then in her 50s, that was in the late 1970s, and she had been a junior midwife, you know, many years before, and she told us this story about how on her first day on the maternity ward, the sister had stood at the top of the ward at 12 o'clock and said, "Right, ladies, left breast now, please." And you guess what follows. And we know that, you know, fashions come and change, and yet at the same time, come and go, and yet at the same time, we're expected to listen to that expert advice. As I've kind of indicated, non-motherhood, either voluntary or involuntary, is stereotyped as one-dimensional. Women who choose not to have children are often stereotyped as selfish. Women who choose not to have children, who want to have children but can't, are often stereotyped as desperate. And yet all women, whether we mother or not, are expected to display the feminine characteristics associated with mothering, not least that of caring and nurturing. The issue of inappropriate identities is interesting, I think, in that on the one hand, if we don't adhere to the stereotypes as a desperate barren woman, or as part of the baby brigade, as it were, as a young mother, then we're kind of problematic and people don't know how to place us. What's sad about this, I think, is that certainly in the research that I've done, people do some distancing of themselves from the stereotype, and by distancing themselves by the stereotype, they're positioning others like them as fitting the stereotype, as it were. So some of the young mothers we spoke to, for example, say, well, you know, I'm not really like a young mother, I'm not really like that. And some of the women who were pursuing infertility treatment would talk about who they thought was more or less deserving of the type of treatment that they wanted. So I guess that's one of the sad bits of kind of the challenging of the stereotypes, is that people actually still work with the stereotypes to distance themselves from them. The ideologies and expectations of ideal motherhood affect all of us, affect all women in both our private and public lives, whether we're mother or not, I would say. And the image of the ideal woman, who is arguably synonymous with the image of the ideal mother, affects us all, whether we mother or not. So I've been interested in these. We've been talking about words quite a lot at this conference. I've been really interested with the difference between mother, non-mother, and non/mother, because of course we might be different things at different times in our lives. We might define ourselves differently. We've had some discussions about who is a real mother and who is a true mother and who is a pretend mother and all of those things. I think all of that comes up in this too. And I'm interested in the difference, as I've said, between mother and other, and as a mother who's considered to be other because she's not considered to be an appropriate mother, which, as I've said, is quite a lot of mothers, really. And of course, there is a difference between the status of mother and the experience of mothering, and we don't have to be mothers to mother. So that's another issue too. And then that gets us into the whole issue, which again we've talked about at this conference about whether we're good or good enough as mothers, and in the mothering we do. And I've been interested in those kind of issues too, some of which I'll talk about in a minute. I'm also interested to challenge, I also think it's important to challenge the idea of motherhood just being women's business. It is important to bring men back into the debate to talk about their relationship with mothers and with their children. Just wanted to show you a picture at this time. I have a complex relationship to this picture, which is the front cover of Reproductive Health Matters. It was a whole edition on, as I think you can see, that's living without children, and yet the pictures are all of children. So my first reaction to this, when I saw this, I was so cross, I actually wrote a letter to the editor. My first reaction was that, why depict non-motherhood about what isn't there? And, that's the issue. There's no way to describe a woman who hasn't got children except by her loss, or what she hasn't got, non-mother, childless, child-free. But then the other issue is that that's a complete misnomer anyway, because, very few women who don't mother are child-free or childless. We all have children in our lives in different ways. So again, I think it's important to think carefully about these issues. Keith Oatley argues that the simulations of fiction, personal truths can be explored. The personal truths can be explored that allow readers to experience emotions, their own emotions, and understand aspects of them that are obscure in relation to context in which the emotions arise. I've always found fiction really, I wanted to talk about this at this conference, I've always found fiction really helpful when trying to understand the issues that are relevant to my personal and professional autobiography. A few years ago, I was asked for the British Sociological Association magazine network to list my Desert Island Discourses, it's called, to list the books that had influenced me. And along with C. Wright Mill's Sociological Imagination and Liz Stanley and Sue Why's book on feminist epistemology, I listed Joanna Trollope's Other People's Children, which I've read because I felt the interesting connections between about how children move in and out of our lives and how we relate to different children in different sorts of ways. An early piece that I wrote with a colleague, Catherine Williams, about our research, but also about my identification as childless and hers as child-free. We engaged with Sarah Maitland's Daughter of Jerusalem as we did that, which we found a really interesting way, because we looked at the way in which the protagonist, who was a childless woman, the main heroine of the piece, who was a childless woman, had been defined by others and how she defined herself. And I really like that book because there isn't an ending where you don't know what's going to happen. She might be pregnant or she might not at the end, which I like because, again, it isn't just a resolution. There was a really interesting experience for me, not least because in that piece I actually wrote about, I quote, my parental relationship with my partner's two sons, which the feminist editor of the journal changed to my kind of relationship, parental relationship with my partner's two sons, which I then qualified by saying who live with us full time. So I was allowed to be a parental and not a kind of parental because they live with us full time. I'm currently working with a friend, colleague from Canada, Deborah Davidson, on a piece where we utilise the concept of the good mother and apply it to the expectations of the good academic. And in order to do this, we've drawn on Ira Levin's The Stepford Wives, which I'm hoping most of you know. I'll talk to you about it later if you don't, which is essentially about a group of women who are replaced by robots who are perfect wives. So just thinking of the relevance of this quote to both motherhood and academia. There's always something or other that has to be done, Carol says. You know how it is. I have to finish cleaning the kitchen now. Similarly, Stepford wife Mary Ann and replies to the question about the possibility of joining a women's group, "No, I don't think I'll have any time for anything like that. There's always so much to do around the house, you know." I wrote a piece in 2008 with a colleague, Maggie Kirkman, where we thought about different ways in which to present our data and our autobiographical reflections, and we actually wrote the piece in the genre of a fairy tale. So we drew on our autobiography, we drew on our respondents, and we positioned the social mother and the non-mother as, you know, as the evil witch, as it were, in a fairy tale, and tried to challenge that in that way. So I've been thinking for a while, and the rest of the paper is about this really, of different ways in which we can present the things that we think are important. This is just an example of another way to tell stories and to tell research stories. These are two stills from a video, a DVD, that I helped to produce from some of the work with young mothers in Coventry. So one of the things that we said at the end of one of our projects was that there needed to be some training for health and care professionals, not just to help them to challenge their own prejudices, but to help young women to deal with the prejudices that they face from others. Because one bad experience puts someone off. So they said, okay, you go away and you prepare the training pack. So we did, and we got young mothers to work with us, and they delivered the training with us, and we made short plays of the data. So it wasn't just one person's story, it was kind of a combination of stories. And these are two stills from two of the stories where the young people were acted in. So again, another way to kind of present what we're working on. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about current work at the moment. And as I've said, what I'm thinking about at the moment is thinking about different ways in which to do writing and to tell stories. And I should have said this earlier, but I've given a couple of papers this year, not directly on this issue, but with some similar points. And at the end of one of them, one of the audience members said that my presentations need to come with a health warning, so I'm just giving you the health warning now, okay? I'm sorry I didn't give it you at the beginning. So at the moment, again with Deborah Davidson, I'm doing a piece of work looking at social support on the internet following perinatal loss, so the kind of support that individuals access after they have lost a baby, either through death or had a baby taken away from them at birth. And we're using what some people have called, to present our data, what some people have called ethnographic fiction or autobiographical fiction, but we're calling composite narratives of collective experience. And essentially, we're doing this in a way to protect the identity of some of the people that we're using, but also to give a flavour, a good flavour of the issues without actually just concentrating on one person's experience. And so I'm going to read you a couple of examples, and they're, as I've said, they're from the composite collections, as it were. And the first example shows that in some ways little has changed since the first piece that research I undertook on miscarriage 25 years ago. I lost my son at 34 weeks last year. He was born sleeping. Previously, I'd had 3 miscarriages, and now I've been told I'm unlikely to get pregnant again. It seems it's my responsibility to make others feel better, to make them comfortable when they talk to me. The people I supported through their own trials and tribulations have abandoned me. They still expect support from me, but don't give me any. The only support I get is from others like me. We care for each other, but it's not enough. I've had to stop looking at Facebook, especially since my best friend got pregnant, but her scanned pictures are there. Her excitement is evident. I feel hurt, bitter and jealous. I avoid people with babies. They avoid me. I'm no longer part of their club. I'm an outcast. I'm no longer part of their club, I've heard throughout all of my research for the last 25 years. And this second example is from a composite of grandmothers, just to show, as I've said, that, you know, these things don't leave us really and come and go at different times in our lives. I'm a granny who has who had lost a granddaughter, and I'm so grateful for this support, even though I wasn't sure whether I should post or not. I'm so glad I did. I can't tell you how wonderful the support I've received has been. I do understand how you mums feel. I lost 2 babies of my own. The pain is worse as I grieve for my own loss and that of my daughter. Okay. Other current work that I'm doing is what I'm called personal writing in academic spaces, and I've begun to play with a bit of other writing, which I'm not quite sure how to define, so I've called it various things there. In her own autobiography, Anne Oakley uses a mixture of fact and fiction. She begins the book by acknowledging the relationship between her own life and those of others, both known to her and not. She says, I have tried self-consciously to draw together in this book some of the connecting threads between my life and the lives of others, between the issues that concern me and those that are of general concern to others. As I've said, from the beginning of my academic career, I've written autobiographically. The following is from a piece I wrote in 2008, which was focusing on feminism, non-motherhood and loss. And what about the ambivalence of my own identity? If good motherhood is synonymous with good womanhood, surely this impacts on my status, not only as a mother, but as a woman. But if motherhood is really about nurturing and not merely or even about biological and kinship connections, surely I am a mother, no need for the word step. But when I came into their lives, my stepsons already had a mother, something I never denied. So although I cared and cooked, provided financial support and affection, I was always Gail, never mum. This has struck me even more in recent years because as my husband's sons become estranged from him, they have become estranged from me. But even if a mother is just about biology and biological connections, I am a mother in that I carried a child for 16 weeks. But I was never able to name my biological child or hold it. You see, it doesn't even have a sex or play with it. So in both these cases then, am I nearly a mother, but not quite, not really? My desires and intentions have been subject to change, and as I shift my position on what James Monach has called the voluntary-involuntary childless continuum. I appreciate that my choices are constrained, borrowing from Rosalind Paczewski, made within circumstances not of my own making, but of course this is not unusual, and indeed relevant to the reproductive choices that all women make. So even though I'm aware of the constraints on my choice, it feels like a choice nevertheless. 26 years ago, when I had my miscarriage, my central aim was to be a mother, and I felt I was only half a woman without a child. Any doubts or ambivalences I had about becoming a mother, I denied. Now I feel very different. I no longer feel a lesser woman or less than adult for not mothering children. I'm also able to accept the equivocal nature of my desires. That is, a part of me enjoys the freedom that I have had and have because of my biologically childless state. If I had become a biological mother, I know that I would have felt opposing emotions in relation to this experience also. A second piece I'm going to read is from a conference paper that I gave earlier this year at the British Sociological Association Autobiography Conference. Okay, that's okay. I went to visit my mum and dad today. It's my mum and dad, by the way, and me. I went to visit my mum and dad today. I took flowers. It's November, and as I arrived in the village, I was battered by rain and hail. No sea spray as the tide was well out. My dad once walked along this road with me, worried that I might be swept away on my way to catch the college bus. Often we were drenched through to our underwear because of the wind's salty waves. Today the weather calmed during the short walk to the graveyard, and as I was arranging the blooms, a bright rainbow graced the horizon. The weak sun came out briefly and shone on the three of us. I was about 8 when I first began to think about human death. I was in the bath and cried noisily until my parents managed to convince me that it would be a long, long time before either of them died. They were lying, of course. My dad left us 12 short years later in 1979, when I still felt like his little girl. And although my mum and I were 80 and 53 respectively in 2012 when she died, it was far too soon a parting for both of us. I'm going to miss you so much, she said to me a few days before her death. At the same time, true to her optimistic approach and stoical nature, she was telling others that she was not too bad at all when asked how she was. The only living thing I'd grieved for prior to the tears in the bath episode was a goldfish. I have a photo of my cousin Dawn and I proudly displaying Pinky and Perky, I don't remember which is which, in their new bowls before the bus trip home, back from our nan's house. At the end of the journey, there was more water in our father's laps than there was left for the fish. Dawn's fish died, sadly, a month later, but mine lived longer, a couple of years, I think, time enough to get attached. Around the same time as our death discussion, I remember my parents telling me that in a few months I would have a new brother or sister. My memory assures me that once again I was in the bath, but I have no one to check the accuracy of this with. The baby never arrived as my mother experienced either a late period or an early miscarriage. I remain an only child, an orphan now. Most people laugh a little when I say I'm an orphan, but sure enough, the dictionary definition is a child whose parents are dead. But I am their child, and they are dead, and I feel orphaned without them. I can remember my exasperated, "Oh, Mum," when right up until her death, my mum would remind me not to stand too close to the platform edge at the railway station, or to remember to air my underwear. I remember laughing and stopping her when sitting on the bath side and washing my back. She then proceeded to wash my face for me too. I was 51 at the time. Now I just wish she was here to get exasperated with, to laugh with. What's left and what I want to do is to live my life in a way that celebrates the lives of those who shaped mine. In a novel I read shortly after my mum died, I found a reference to a poem, The Summer Day, by Mary Oliver, the last 3 lines of which are, "Doesn't everything die at last too soon? Tell me what it is you plan to do with your one wild and precious life." On first reading this, I felt the call to be accountable. I still feel this, but the responsibility doesn't feel like a pressure. I feel sure that my sociological imagination is relevant to how I do grief. Yet another opportunity to reflect on the relationship between self and other, between other and self. In this talk, I said it was part of an academic paper, and I went on to talk about how I felt responsible in my research relationships too. So I was talking in the paper about how my life had affected my work and my work had affected my life, and how I felt my personal responsibilities in some way reflected my responsibilities in the field and my responsibilities with respondents. All right for 5 minutes? Okay, great. Okay, so as I said, both these pieces were written for academic audiences, but more recently, I've also begun to experiment with different types of stories. I mean, they're all stories, aren't they? But with different types of stories. I feel a bit embarrassed about these two, given some of the wonderful stuff that I've heard at this conference, but I'm going to share them anyway. Okay, so this first piece is quite short. I'm calling it fiction, but it's very related to all of the research that I've done, and it's also relevant in terms of my autobiography also. And it's called A Wonderful Life. Conceived in love and born to celebration, the child is a beauty, healthy and strong as well, quick to smile and sleep through the night. She is record-breaking in potty training, walking and talking. School days are happy. She is as popular as she is clever, as artistic as she is athletic. Success is achieved across the board. University follows and ends with a piece of paper confirming what her parents already knew, best in class. Though through university and for a while after, she happily plays the relationship field and has 1 or 2 semi-serious relationships, all learning experiences, no broken hearts, nothing to worry her ever-concerned parents. Then she meets her soulmate and marries a little earlier than her peers, in the same years as her promotion to partner in the practice, much earlier than anyone else in the firm. 3 children follow, and the growing family years are full of laughter and fun, of holidays in the sunshine, and more certificates than the walls of her beautiful home can take. One by one, the children leave, happy partnerships and good jobs secured. Alone with her partner, both name and experience, their mother does not suffer from any empty nest symptoms. Applauded for her charity work, well known in the community and beyond, an accolade from the reigning monarch is the crowning glory to a glittering career. Retirement is full, supported not only by well-earned pensions, but also a not-so-small win on the lottery. 10 happy years follow until her husband dies in his sleep. She lives for almost another decade, amply fulfilling the roles of doting grandmother. Oh, it's a bit early. Never mind, I'll leave it. It's a nice one. It's my mum. Amply fulfilling the roles of doting grandmother and faithful friend, Content with her lot, she dies gently as her husband did. Her funeral is a celebration of a life well lived. A familiar ache and tugging feeling disturbs my daydream and prompts me to go to the loo. My knickers are wet, there is blood. My dream of my child's wonderful life dashed for yet another month. So this second piece is, I think it's a memoir, okay? Although it's not completely all about me, but it is mostly. And I don't know what to call this one. I've called it Love, but maybe you could help me with that. I'm thinking back to the day when my mum thought I meant to kill myself. No babies for me, it seemed. A realisation I felt painfully through my body. Not just a reaction to an externally defined feminine ideal, but rather a complete challenge to all my hopes and expectations. On the day in question, I ran from my mum towards the river. Don't, she shouted, running after me. But I never intended to jump in and didn't want to run from her, but from myself, from the body that I felt had let me down. I have adapted, I have been fulfilled in other ways. The following nearly 30 years have been busy. I feel privileged to have been able to spend so much time researching and writing about issues that I and others feel are important, yet often misunderstood and or misrepresented. I'm grateful for the meaningful relationships I have with the children and more recently grandchildren of others. But I feel sure that I would not have survived intact, reformed as whole, without my mother's support and unconditional love. For her, it was all about me, always about me. And it was not until after her death that I realised she never, ever spoke of her own loss. No babies for me, no grandbabies for her. Since her death, I have, unusually for me, suffered quite a bit of physical illness, including a burst eardrum, which my GP tells me is normally an infant's problem, which seems strangely appropriate when, like a child, all I've wanted for much of the last 18 months is my mum. This particular ailment occurred in February, and it was very cold, so I didn't leave the house for 3 days. Stir crazy, I put some cotton wool in my ear and a close-fitting hat on in preparation for a walk. I go into the bathroom for a wee and look in the mirror, and there she is, my mum, my Dorothy, looking back at me. I'm shocked but pleased, and I take off my glasses, which I need for long, but I can't see any of you. I need for long, but not for short distance vision to get a better look. It's the way the hat frames my face that highlights the features I've inherited from my mother. I'm usually compared to my dad in looks. She's always with me, in my head and my heart, and now I see her in my face as well. So, just this is the end. Couldn't do much more after that. This paper really charts my personal writing, research, and personal journey of non/motherhood in the last 30 years. And as you'll see, I've reflected on my status as a daughter as well as my status as a non-mother. And I've only recently begun to do that, and I'm finding it really interesting. And as I said, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have been able to do it here. I find Frank, Lawler and Richardson, I won't read the quotes out, but you can see them all really helpful in terms of thinking about how the stories we tell as academics and as people, personal and professional, what they mean, basically. What is the use of the stories that we tell, and what is the meaning of them? Increasingly, I believe that different forms of writing, different forms of presentation, different ways to present our data, if we're talking about impact, if I write something that, let's just say, got published in a mainstream women's magazine, how much more impact might that have than something I write for an academic journal? I haven't done that yet, but would like to think that maybe I could. So all of these different ways and different forms are relevant to the feminist sociological project and are relevant to us as academics. But, and this returns me full circle really, with theorised subjectivity in mind, I think at the same time we need to still constantly interrogate both our privileged position and the significance of our personhood within what we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very moved. That's all I can say at this point. Thinking of my mum and dad meeting, there used to be a black club just up in the late 1940s, just up on Tottenham Court Road, called the Paramount. That's where my mum and dad met, and so I'm thinking about those journeys. Anyway, thank you very much, Gail. I'm going to open it to the floor. We can have 10 minutes or so, is that right? Yeah, okay. We'll go into the coffee time thing. Shall I take 2 or 3 questions or at once and then gather them up? Is that all right? So 2 or 3. Yeah, I see you in the grey. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I was wondering if in your work with infertile, and I'm putting that in those scare quotes, infertile women, if part of your investigation involved exploring their attitudes toward adoption as a desirable, possibly desirable alternative, because certainly the infertility industry, right, it's in their best interest to not explore that, right, with women they're working with. So, thanks.
Okay. Go straight. Yeah. Sorry. Are you? Sorry, I didn't. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, got that one. So adoption. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gail. Like the other Gail, I feel very grateful for you and for your body of work over the years. It's incredibly important to those of us working sort of at the interface between ethnography, motherhood, feminism, and so on. I want to sort of raise this issue, I guess, about sort of terms again, sort of trying to think about the difficulties but also potentials of completely dislodging, if you like, maternal practice that is a kind of election of another as your child. The idea of a kind of use of the term mother to mean something to do with a choice, to do with how one relates to another, who may or may not be a child. So whether that as a kind of way of understanding motherhood might or might not be actually helpful as a way forward. And the reason it might not be is because what you so importantly do is constantly bring us back to some kind of notion of identification and about the body. And if that's the case, then birthing another might make a difference. And so I suppose I want to try and just open up that difficult discussion, because without it we're sort of slightly left with some indeterminate unspoken dialogues here about what on earth we are talking about when we utilise that term mother. And I can see you've made a number of attempts to talk about mother, non-voluntary, whatever, so you end up with this additive thing.
Why don't you go with those two? Sorry, my fault.
My research was, I focused on definition and identity, so I advertised in a variety of places, and I asked people to come forward if they identified or they had ever identified as either or infertile involuntary childless. So I had a whole mixture of people, youngest in their 20s, oldest in their 70s. I had people who were undertaking infertility treatment. I had people who had undertaken infertility treatment and it hadn't worked for them. I had some people who'd gone on to adopt. I had some people who were mothering the children of their partners. I had some people who had got pregnant eventually without help. I had some people who had successful. So there were a whole mix. And the adoption issue was quite interesting in that I did have a few people about 3 or 4 who had adopted. And I remember one quote particularly. One woman had then gone on for some more treatment, been offered some more treatment, and it had been unsuccessful again. And she said, but it didn't matter that time, Gail, no empty arms. So, I mean, actually that relates back almost to your point. So, but I also found that there were significant minority, it was qualitative, but there were, I did interviews and I did research by correspondence. So I did people, before the days of email, people who wrote to me letters. So there were 80 odd women in my study group, and there was a significant minority who talked about wanting to consider adoption, but their partner not being interested. So that seemed to be an interesting gender difference in that project at least. Sorry. I think, yes, you're right. I mean, I'm frustrated, really, that, you know, there isn't a way to describe some of the relationships we have other than in this kind of very narrow way. Yet at the same time, I do think I'm kind of comforted by the fact that despite the language, there do seem to be practices that challenge the language. So I'm going to talk personally again now, but about 15 years ago, I was at a school reunion where I told Chrissy this story last night, where I met a school friend who, when we were in school, she was the really high achiever and I was the, you know, planning to get married and have babies, and it kind of worked out the other way around. I'd got a career and she got married and had babies. And she said to me at this party, never mind, Gail, you can share mine. And I don't remember her saying this, and afterwards she said she felt really awful because it was so crass. And actually I do share her children, and there are other children and grandchildren that and I kind of didn't expect that would happen, and I'm sure I'm not unique, and I'm sure so I do think that, you know, sociologists talk about living in families of choice rather than, you know, families of kin or families of marriage, and I do think people now are living their lives in different sorts of ways, which helps us challenge some of these kind of rigid categories. It's just the external discourse still perpetuates the rigid categories, and that if you're able to live differently, it's kind of lucky actually that you're able to kind of challenge that, really. So you know, I remain kind of frustrated that there isn't really any way to describe a woman who hasn't got a child without kind of reference to not having the child. But as I said, it's a complete misnomer anyway, because, you know, even many of the friends that I have who are, in their words, child-free, they're not. You know, they have godchildren and friends, and they have children stay for weekends, or they teach, or whatever.
And then, sorry, this is and in the pink after, yeah.
Me first?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you also have pink.
I just want to ask you to elaborate a bit more about using fiction in order to tell your own story, not the story of others, which I understand, but why do you need fiction to tell your autobiography?
Okay.
Okay. Who's the pink one?
I also enjoyed your presentation immensely. Thank you very much. And I just wanted your views, your experience, or your opinion on the idea of the care system and the state as mother, and the relationship of intrusion, be it a dangerous intrusion, over-intrusive, or protective intrusion. And we've had a few cases, you know, too many cases over the last years where there have been abuse of children and the state has failed or has protected children. And then obviously, you know, a couple of very disturbing recent cases where police have swooped in and, you know, taken children from Roma families. So, and the absence of dialogue between these two sets of mothers, if you like, the state as mother and the mothering mother, and whether you see that, is there any dialogue between these two, which would be absolutely imperative, I would have thought.
Thank you, Gail. That was wonderful. I just wanted to ask if any of your research has taken you into interviews with people considering transgender operations.
Okay. I don't think I have to use fiction to tell my own experience, and anyone who knew anything about my work could find out all sorts of things about me. But I think it's another way, you know, it's another way, and it's another interesting way. And I've only just, as I said, you know, I've only recently started to write in this way, and it's very interesting because it's very freeing. You don't have to have any references, for goodness sake, you know. It's really freeing, but at the same time, I've been doing some reading about it, and there are equally the rules in fiction writing as there are rules in academic writing. So. And the thing about writing, when you're writing something and the thing is, fact and fiction. There's fact in fiction and fiction in fact again. The relationship is so blurred. But I've written a few pieces that are very much fiction, but with a bit of autobiography in them. And I've written other pieces that are very autobiographical with a tiny bit of fiction and vice versa. And it's just a kind of another interesting way to play with ideas that you think are important, I think. So I don't think I have to, but I think it's another way in which we can tell stories. And as I've said, I think it's a way. I've always tried in my academic writing to be accessible. I don't know if I've always got it right, but I've always really tried. And I've been told on occasion that people have found my work accessible. And I guess this is another way to tell important stories accessibly and to a different group of people, maybe. Maybe different people will read. I've had A Wonderful Life published online. So, maybe different people will read A Wonderful Life, the little story about the thwarted pregnancy, as it were, and think, oh, yeah, than, the people who read my academic work. State system. I suppose, I think, one of the phrases I've used, I don't think I used it today, but one of the phrases I used in relation to teenage pregnancy and young motherhood is, damned if you do and damned if you don't, really. And I suppose, again, it's just about what makes me anxious is, the prevalence of persistent stereotypes and external discourses around certain people as deserving and undeserving. I've engaged with the deserving, undeserving debate quite a lot, both in relation to infertility and in relation to young parenthood and to other research that I've done. And I guess it's very easy to be defined not only as not good enough, but as undeserving. And I think maybe that's happening in some of the examples that you're giving, really. Christine, remind me again? No, but that would be very interesting. But no. I think there was one back there, was there?
Yeah, that's right there. Anybody else? No?
Thank you very much for a really lovely presentation, and also the presentation of your mother and the honouring you did of her. That was lovely. My question is whether or not there's any work being done on looking at relinquishing motherhood. I mean, the kind of life cycle of motherhood, because there's a way in which one can hang on to it beyond its need for what's happening for the child and the other that's growing up socially. And I just wonder if there's a meeting to be done about that particularly child-free and childless women can be in some way pioneers and assistants of the ways in which one reaches another stage of development and relationship. And I think there's something about the power dynamic of mothers that can involve a holding on to something that is well worth exploring how to do it differently in a different world.
I don't know. I mean, maybe other people will be able to answer this. It makes me think of something slightly different in that some of the work that I've done is around looking at mothers as an institutional resource. So there has been some research done on women in prison where the dynamics in a women's prison play out quite differently than the dynamics in a men's prison, where older women are actually expected to mother younger women within that total institution. We were talking about total institutions yesterday, and I did some work a few years ago with a colleague looking at non-mothers in higher education and how women who don't mother in education talk about being seen as having all of the qualities that mothers would have, but none of the responsibility, and outside of the institution. Therefore, they were expected to do different kinds of emotional labour within the institution because of that. And I think that lasts all our lives. I suppose my point is that lasts all our lives. So I know there's been some work around the relationships between, a friend of mine did some really interesting work on the relationship between mothers-in-laws and daughters-in-laws, and Pam Cottrell, and she didn't interview mothers-in-laws and daughters-in-laws who related to each other, but she interviewed a subset of daughters-in-laws and a subset of mothers-in-laws, and that was really interesting in terms of the reciprocal relationships, but also the tension between the two generations, and the feelings of the mother towards her son and the relationship of the daughter within that. So maybe that's something that you might find interesting.
Okay, is there one more? Okay, one more, and then I think we'd have to stop. Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Gail. That was really good. Just wait for a minute. Sorry.
There's another one there.
Thanks, that was really good and very intellectually engaging, as well as the autobiographical, moving stuff. I hope when I'm all grown up that I'll be able to do the same sort of keynote. Anyway, you said about the gendered nature of mothering quite early on, and you had a sort of small discussion about, because you had a small set of fathers as well. And I was just wondering, because I'm thinking about this in my work around the caring relationship and mothering, and in my earlier work did interview fathers as well around their disabled children, and I was just wondering about that gendered nature, and I thought I just wanted a response about whether you think fathers mother, or whether that fathers can only father, and whether or not there is actually that essence of mothering that fathers or carers can do, or whether it is actually exclusive to mothers. And I think Andrew Dowsett might have written, I don't know the work to refer to, but she's talked about mothering and that gender nature, and I wondered if you thought about that, because you've obviously interviewed some fathers.
Okay. Just take that one as well.
Too quickly. Thank you very much. I just wondered whether you have at any point gone along the pathway of same-sex couples and mothering, and perhaps just to tuck on to the previous question, how two father households mother, as opposed to two mother households mothering.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I know all of. Recently, for some writing I'm doing recently, I've read Tony Chapman's book, which is about gender and domestic practices, and he reports on a study of 200 different studies or something that show that even in dual career families, it's always women that do, the majority of the domestic labour, as it were. And then I'm thinking also of Jill Dunn's work, where she looks at same-sex lesbian relationships, and her argument is that there's more shared labour than there is within heterosexual relationships. So I'm aware of all those, those work really, which I think add something really interesting to the debate. I haven't myself done work on same-sex relationships, but I'm aware of that work. In terms of my own relationship, my own work with fathers, my point has always been that we need to bring men back into the debate, not just as fathers, but also in relation to infertility, and the fact that a lot of the infertility experts are men, so we need to bring men back in that way. Some really interesting stuff with the young parents, because again there were kind of extremes. So as I've said, there were some young women who were in relationships that we would definitely describe as abusive, because the most extreme case was a 14-year-old girl who got pregnant twice to a man 20 years her age, and every time she was separated from him, she went back to him as soon as she could. And we would describe it as abusive, but she didn't, you know, so that's kind of one. But there were lots of other examples of what we might call unequal power relationships in their relationships with their partners and with their parents. But there were other examples of young families that very definitely challenge the stereotype in terms of it being very clearly a shared parental relationship with their children. And again, you know, I briefly talk about my own experience again. I briefly mentioned the fact that my partner's children lived with us for 10 years because my partner had custody. Now, I don't know quite what to call what he did, but, you know, he did everything for them, really. And it was certainly an extremely loving relationship, and whether he was a mother or a father or both, who knows. And as I've begun to think back about my own life too, my father, very unusually, he was a working class man, very unusually for a man of his class, had a very adventurous spirit, and we spent 15 years travelling around, really. And he left a memoir when he died. He'd written a memoir, and he wrote about his own relationship with his father and his relationship with my mother and me. And, well, I don't know, my father, I don't know, something. But, you know, no way, 1950s hands off, 1930s hands off, you know, who knows, you know.
I'm aware of the time. We're going to have to call it to close then. Thank you everyone for great questions. Thank you, Gail, again.